Joseph in the Old Testament was a wise and gifted patriarch whom God used in a historical timeline in his plan of salvation, looking at the really big picture of why God placed him where he did at the time he did. One of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is the story of Joseph, who was sold into slavery as a 17-year-old by his jealous and angry brothers. And we don't have the privilege to read all the between the lines emotional anguish that he went through, but you can start to put it together to see that he probably never, ever, ever saw his mother again as a teenager when he went down to Egypt, being sold by the Midianites. And one aspect of Joseph's incredible strength comes through in his actions, in his life, in his integrity, which we will zoom in on. Can you imagine how easy, though, first of all, it would have been to languish in self-pity as a servant in the house of Potiphar, one of the royal officials at the time, day in and day out, just dwelling on the things he lost, on the injustice of his brothers that put him into that position, and how much he lost and how unfair life was. Can you imagine trying to place yourself in his shoes to imagine the frustration, again, as a young teenager? Stephen Covey's #1 best-selling book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, point out an aspect of Joseph's life from his own internal strengths. Stephen Covey says Joseph was proactive. He worked on the here and now, not on what should have been or what could have been. He demonstrated a, quote, what I can do now in the situation I'm in, which helped him to rise to success. Stephen Covey calls this kind of response working on being instead of working on having. Now, within a short period of time, as the story goes, Joseph was running Potiphar's household. Potiphar held a high position, as I mentioned. Here was Joseph, a Hebrew slave, ordering around Egyptian servants under him in Egypt, of all places. So he's put in charge of all of Potiphar's house, and it says Potiphar only had to think about what he was going to eat every day. He didn't have to worry about anything having to do with managing his household. He was diligent. He had a strong work ethic. He had integrity, as we're going to see. Well, we all know that one day Joseph was caught in a difficult situation when Potiphar's wife tried to get him to compromise his integrity and his faithfulness. He was unjustly imprisoned for 13 long years, or at least a large portion of that 13 years. There's a psalm in Psalm 105, verse 18, I won't turn. It just says, they bruised his feet with shackles. His neck was put in irons. So you can see when he was cast into a dungeon for something he didn't do, he was innocent of. He was mistreated. And again, he finds himself in a position where he could have said, woe is me, I'm in a horrible place. But no, what does he do? Well, he becomes proactive even in the prison. Soon he's managing prisoners while God is watching very closely and guiding events in his life and blessing him. Eventually, Joseph, in a stunning change because he can interpret dreams, again, a gift from God, he is brought out of prison, put royal garments on, cleaned up, presented before Pharaoh, and now, before long, he's second in charge of all of Egypt after Pharaoh himself. Now, this story gives us lessons of responsibility to take control of our personal lives and how a person can powerfully influence personal circumstances in our lives, working on what we are, what we've been given, and what we do with it. So in this split sermon, I'd like to share 5 biblical principles of wise money stewardship. to help us weather very difficult times ahead of us in this country. The title today is simply Financial Lessons from Joseph. Financial Lessons from Joseph. Now, as a subtitle, I could have called this a focus on finances in the book of Proverbs, because we're going to spend a fair amount of time in Proverbs. But let's go on to, first of all, share some bad news before I get to the good news. Isn't that usually the way to go? Way to do it? First the bad news and then some good news. As most of us have been watching on current news topics, the gross domestic product, the GDP of this country, was published this past Thursday, just 2 days ago. It showed that we have entered the classic definition of a recession, in spite of some of the controversy over trying to redefine a long-standing classic definition of what is a recession. Morgan Stanley economists issued a report declaring a, quote, technical recession for the economy, saying, quote, real GDP contracted in the second quarter. And they cite the last 2 quarters when spending on both durable and non-durable goods was in significant decline, caused by a record decline in grocery spending, as high food costs are prompting consumers to purchase less expensive items. And they're talking about people going into stores looking for more generic, branded goods and less of the fancy foods that they're used to buying in this country. Economist Mohammed El-Arian stated shortly after the GDP numbers were published Thursday, quote, the U.S. economy is slowing at a significant rate. Add to that the 8.7% price change in today's data, and the bottom line is clear: deepening stagflation and flashing red recession risk. Another economist, Desmond Lockman, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, expects, quote, a hard economic landing by year's end. He said consumer sentiment is close to a record low as inflation erodes wages. And here's a little calculation I made, and you've heard different calculations probably over the last several weeks of the loss of purchasing power, they call it, or spending power of the American consumer. Since this time last year, yours and my purchasing power has decreased by 9.06%. That means 9% inflation has eaten away what we can spend each dollar on compared to a year ago. Well, I looked at 2 websites to get this calculation here, but the average Michigan single-family income, not two-family income or two-income families, but single-family income right now, on average, is $56,343. The loss of purchasing power over a 2-year period, and I chose 2 years because in July 2020, we were at 1% inflation rate. Now we're at 9.06% inflation rate. So let's say it's 8% increase in 2 years. What does that mean then? It means we will have lost $4,845 of spending power in a given year over what we had 2 years ago. $4,845 more to buy the same goods. It sounds terrifying, and a lot of people are suffering, and a lot of people are hurting right now in this country. The economist Lockman said the housing market is crumbling as a result of the doubling in the mortgage interest rate, and our exporters are facing strong headwinds as a result of a strong dollar. That sounds good, but that just means that other countries will buy less and less of our exported goods. And economic troubles in Europe, China, and the emerging market economies. How should you and I respond emotionally and physically to this bad news, which in many ways, as I was studying this, parallels some of the economic downturn we faced in 2008, A lot of economists look at 2008 as a very difficult time in this country, too. Well, Jesus Christ talked about living a spiritually abundant life, but it also includes other kinds of abundance as well. And he doesn't want us to live a life of fear and anxiety over what's over the horizon, what is coming up in the next few months to a year. I won't turn, but Jesus said in John 10, verse 10, I have come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly. You see, abundant life also includes a financial state of peace of mind. And throughout the Bible, we can find specific financial principles and advice. And when we properly apply them, they will benefit us. Now let's look at 5 principles that I've chosen today in this split sermon. 5 principles. Principle number 1 of 5 has to do with our attitude toward money. Principle number 1 has to do with our attitude toward money. Now, money is, in one sense, a necessary evil. But it doesn't mean it's evil by itself when I say that. The saying says it's a necessary evil, just like death and taxes are necessary evils. It is a necessary medium of exchange because we live in a monetary society. We don't barter with goods, we exchange with money. It doesn't have to be evil. Whether money is a good or bad influence depends on our approach to money. It is said money makes a good servant, but a poor master. It can separate us from our family members and from God if we catch ourselves in opposition with God's directives and his instruction, as we chase an unwinnable race after wealth. We can become intoxicated and enslaved to money if we let money do that to us. You see, Jesus Christ and the Father are not opposed to wealth or a high standard of living. Yes, wealth and riches can bring new temptations. That's stated in the Bible many places. But I don't think anyone in this immediate audience faces that kind of a problem. I say that tongue-in-cheek, I don't think so. So some have counted more than 2,300 verses in the Bible on how to handle money and possessions. There's a lot to be said in the Bible. The book of Proverbs, a guidebook with precious advice on many subjects, contains a lot of those statements on finances, on money and wealth and possessions. Let's begin turning in our Bibles together. We're going to spend a good bit of time in Proverbs with this split sermon. Please turn to Proverbs chapter 3 with me. Proverbs chapter 3, and as I usually do, I'll ask you to put a marker in Proverbs. We'll refer back here several times. Proverbs 3, verse 9. If you're turning, this shows us that we must not let money become overly important to us. Indeed, one of the first statements in this chapter of Proverbs shows that we should honor God, who owns everything. Proverbs 3, verse 9, honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase. So, if we do so, in other words, our barns will be filled with plenty and our vats will overflow with new wine. It's a principle talking about tithes and offerings. It's essential that we return 10% of what we labor for to the one who gives it to us, because God says it belongs to him. The first 10% of all of our income earned by labor is his. It belongs to God. Now, if you skip with me to Proverbs 23 and verse 4, Proverbs 23 and verse 4, in the New Living Translation, it says, don't wear yourself out trying to get rich. Be wise enough to know when to quit. I liked the New Living Translation plain, simple English on this one. We're not to wear ourselves out trying to get rich. Be wise enough to know when to quit, it says. Please, well, I won't turn, but I'll bring up 1 Timothy 6. Money is an integral part of the right kind of success. On the other hand, it's the love of money that has corrupted and twisted the lives of many people, brought them great sorrows. I won't turn. 1 Timothy 6, verse 10. Paul says, and I'll read this one in the Phillips Modern English Translation, 1 Timothy 6, verse 10, "For loving money leads to all kinds of evil, and some men in the struggle to be rich have lost their faith and caused themselves untold agonies of mind." And backing up to 1 Timothy 6, verses 7 through 9, same chapter, verses 7 through 9, what does Paul say here? He talks about contentment here with the things we have. "For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. Having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition." What is perdition? That means utter destruction. That also means destruction. So it's very sad that the world chases after things, the love of money, rather than respecting it for what it is and using it as a very helpful tool, which can teach us a lot about integrity and wisdom and good judgment and good stewardship. Money is a powerful tool that God has placed in our hands to use rightly. If I hold my place with you in Proverbs, please come to Matthew 6, verse 31 with me. Matthew 6, verse 31. Here, Jesus Christ tells us if our priorities are right with God, He will provide the essentials we need in this life. This is a hard one for many people to wrap their minds around because it takes effort and focus and attention to keep this straight and narrow path. Let's read together. Matthew 6, verse 31 through 34. "Therefore do not worry, saying, 'What shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear?' For after all these things the Gentiles seek. For your heavenly Father knows that you need these things. But seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. And all these things." What things? Those that were just listed. Those are the things that are essentials for the body, essentials for our family, essentials for life. They shall be added to us. "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble." Now this is, again, hard to do. There is always a place for planning, being organized, budgeting for family, for taking care of our household needs, for our bills, for the mortgage, for the car and the car payments and the gasoline in the car. Those do take planning, but this is talking about worry and anxiety. Jesus Christ is talking about worry and anxiety and fretting over these things that we won't have to do if we put God first. That's what the promise is. And we go back to verse 24 for the full message. We're still in Matthew 6, verse 24. "Nobody can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be loyal to the one and despise the other. We cannot serve both God and mammon, or money." Jesus continues, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or your body, what you'll put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds in the air, for they neither sow nor reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth more than they? Which of you by worrying can add one more cubit to his stature?" And so this goes on, verse 30, skip over to verse 30. "Now, if God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and gone tomorrow, thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? So he's encouraging our growth in faith by focusing our attention on God's kingdom and his righteousness. Putting spiritual matters first, we can count on God filling the voids, even when humanly, physically, it looks impossible to make ends meet. If you go back to Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong's first autobiography, you'll see time and again during the Depression years, 1929 through up until about 1940, the very difficult times he and Loma Armstrong faced, and how God would fill at the last minute at times just what was needed. And he was devoting his life to preaching the gospel in the most humble starting way. When he was, prior to 1929, the stock market crash, essentially a millionaire in terms of his prosperity and the success, the business success he had. And he was plunged into poverty. But you saw over and over and over again in that autobiography the things that God did to meet needs, sometimes at the very moment they were needed. And that was a huge lesson of training in temperance and discipline for Mr. Armstrong in those days. So human logic can often show things that can be so bad physically on the outside to our human eyes, and there could be widespread suffering around us in the years to come. But God says he will supply. So principle number 1 of 5 is to guard our attitude toward money, because it's a very important part of our stewardship and reliance on God and not on physical wealth and material things. Principle number 2, simply, integrity matters. Integrity matters. Please turn to Proverbs 10, verse 22. Proverbs 10, verse 22 with me. While you're turning, it has been said that the test of a man's character is how he spends his time and his money. Now, how a man makes his money can also be a test of character in a big way. How we go about earning money is, in the long run, much more important than how much we earn. How we earn it is much more important than how much we earn. Proverbs 10, verse 22. The blessing of the Lord eternal makes one rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. Now, we understand in the Old Testament vernacular, translated into English, you see the term rich a lot. Now, rich is a different concept in Old Testament times compared to today. Yes, there were some rich patriarchs, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and like Jacob's sons. They became princes, it says in the Bible, and they probably had some pretty good prosperity, the 12 sons of Jacob. And you think of people becoming billionaires in this world now. Well, yeah, there's a huge disparate difference between a shrinking middle class and poor people and the truly rich. But so when we see rich in the Bible, think of the word prosperous. Think of the word financially secure, maybe not being multiple millionaires and billionaires. So what else? It says, back to verse 1, Proverbs 10, verse 1. A wise man makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the grief of his mother. Treasures of wickedness, that means ill-gotten gain by wicked means. So ill-gotten gain, profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death. The Lord will not allow the righteous soul to famish, but he casts away the desire of the wicked. God will not allow the faithful to go hungry. This is so helpful and encouraging to see this. God will not allow his faithful to go hungry. Joseph, back to his lifestyle and his practices and his, just some of his qualities and values. He was, again, falsely accused and not given, apparently, the ability to defend himself when Potiphar, the head of the prison, the royal prison, cast him into a dungeon. Genesis 39:21, I won't turn, it just simply says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." You see, God stands by his people of integrity, just like he did with Joseph. Before long, the prisoners were even placed under Joseph's management. They're in the dungeon, in the prison. And the Lord continued to bless his work, and Joseph's reputation grew, even in such a place as a prison environment. And we know from the end of the story, Joseph's integrity was rewarded most highly. And we learn in such a way that Joseph managed his proactive ability to think about what he could do, where he was, in the situation he was in, that it probably did bring him some peace of mind. And it can do the same for us. God, not the pursuit of wealth and money, should be first, again, in the lives of those who are seeking God. I won't turn, but Matthew 6, verse 19, again, don't lay up treasures on the earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal. Lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there our hearts will also be. Where our treasure is, if it's in God's kingdom and God's righteousness, that's where our heart will be. Once again, there's nothing wrong with having possessions and having money. We can see that a number of patriarchs in the Old Testament were well off financially. The challenge, again, is when money becomes our primary driving force in life. What is our priority is the question. Malachi 3, verse 8. I would like to turn there. Malachi 3, verse 8. It is the passage about tithing that should be very familiar to us. The last book of the Old Testament, Malachi 3, verse 8. God asks the question of his people who have neglected tithes at this point. Remember, Malachi is sent to the people of Judah who have come out of Babylonian slavery after 70 years. And a contingent comes back, they're rebuilding the city and getting established again, but they've neglected a number of things, and one of those was tithes. God is renewing his promise to them as they turn back to him as a nation and they give diligence to tithing. Malachi 3, verses 8 through 10. Will a man rob God? He says to them, yet you have robbed me. And you say, in what way have we robbed you? God answers, in tithes and offerings. So what's the outcome? Verse 9. You're cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. Verse 10, he gives them the instruction that was given in the time of Moses. Bring all your tithes into the storehouses, that there may be food in my house, and try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts. If I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such a blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. Verse 11, and I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, so that he will not destroy the fruit of your ground, nor shall the vine fail to bear fruit for you in the field, says the Lord of hosts. God is saying, prove me now herewith. Now, we're not overall an agricultural society. There are mega farms, but farming is less than, I think it's 2% of all the occupations in the United States, under 3% for sure. I think it may even be 1.5% of all occupations in the U.S. are farming, agriculture, or food production and food services. But God is saying, nonetheless, prove him on these things. God can prosper in other ways. And he did show ancient Israel the devourer was the locust. It was the beetles. It was the moths. It was the worms. It was the things that destroy crops. He says, I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes. And that was a wonderful promise. So principle number 2 out of 5 is that in acquiring wealth, integrity matters. Returning to God what belongs to Him is part of that. Paying our taxes is part of that. Paying our bills in a timely manner is also part of matters of financial integrity. Principle number 3, share with others in need. Share with others in need. This is all part of acquiring financial contentment and security. Paul reminds us of the words of Jesus Christ when he said in Acts 20, verse 35, he says, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Jesus Christ's own words, it's more blessed to give than to receive. Let's turn back to Proverbs 11, verse 24. Proverbs 11, verse 24 together. And while you're turning, it's been said, some of the most miserable people in the world are those who cling to every last penny in their lives, fearful that someone else might get some of it. Now, I didn't come up with that quote. It's an unknown author. But they can be among the most miserable people on earth, those that do not have a generous heart. Proverbs 11, verses 24 and 25. There is one who scatters, gives generously, yet increases more. And there is one who withholds more than is right, but it leads to poverty. The generous soul will be made rich, and he who waters will also be watered himself. The New Revised Standard Version, same verse, NRSV. Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due, and they only suffer want or need. A generous person will be enriched, and one who gives water will get water. Proverbs 22, verse 9. A lot of these proverbs are just one sentence long, so I have a number of them still to share with you. Proverbs 22, verse 9. He who has a generous eye will be blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor. Now, God realizes that a cheerful giver is one who has the means, the resources to be able to give. And that when we give offerings, that is also in proportion to how God has blessed us. That's different than the tithe. The tithe, of course, is 10% of our gainful employment that belongs to God. An offering is a voluntary thing based on how God has blessed us. There are so many passages that have to do with also helping poor people when we have the means to do so. Please hold a place in Proverbs. Come back with me to Psalm 41 and verse 1. Psalm 41 and verse 1. Here we see that there's a promise attached to this dynamic law of giving, this principle of giving. It's like a law. Psalm 41, verses 1 through 3. Blessed is he who considers the poor. The Lord will deliver him in time of trouble. The Lord will preserve him and keep him alive, and he will be blessed on the earth. Let me pause for a moment. Again, I mentioned there are difficult times yet ahead on the horizon. We've been teaching for 75, 80 years now that there will be a time of Jacob's trouble that will first come upon the nations of modern-day Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. Ephraim and Manasseh are the primary subjects at hand in the terms of what's coming upon Jacob. And yet in the time of trouble, look at verses like this, and God will consider his people. He says he will not let them be famished. He will not let them go without food, let them go hungry. These are promises to hold on to, even though around us we may see suffering, we may see, and we already are, a decline of standards of living, a decline of luxury, of comfort, of travel, of buying groceries, the things we're used to, and some people eating simpler and simpler foods, putting cereal on the table for their children instead of normal, wholesome meals. You see this in the news, and you see people getting desperate, taking up much more credit card debt, dipping deeply into savings for retirement and things like that. This is a constant news item right now because of the inflation we're seeing, and food shortages are on the horizon according to some forecasters. Food shortages. Not just that you go to the grocery store and there's some foods that you're used to buying that are not on the shelf. We're talking about more serious things than that. And they are already happening in the poorer countries in the world right now. And so we look to God, and we will see that He will deliver in times of trouble. The Lord will preserve him and keep him alive, and he will be blessed on the earth. You will not deliver him to your enemies, to his enemies. The Lord will strengthen him on his bed of illness. You will sustain him on his deathbed. His sick bed. His sick bed. I have a little typewritten card that I keep taped onto the dashboard of my car. It's this. It's Psalm 41, verse 3. And I read that every time I get in my car, almost all the time I climb in my car. It's just this psalm right here, Psalm 41, verses 1 through 3. And God says he will strengthen him on his bed of illness. He will sustain him on his sick bed. Those people that have a generous eye toward the needy. So principle number 3 is on sharing what we have with others in need as a living law of God that returns blessings emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Principle number 4 out of 5. Principle number 4, wealth comes through diligence. Wealth comes through diligence. Many proverbs on this subject, because so many people on the earth through human history like to get things for a minimal amount of effort, or like to get things for free. They look for shortcuts to wealth. For millions of people, here's an illustration that just came up this morning, because yesterday, Friday, July 29th, there was a person in Illinois who won the Mega Millions jackpot of $1.28 billion. You know what $1.28 billion is? It's 1,280 million. It's a mind-boggling, it's not the highest jackpot ever. I think the highest one is like 1.5 billion. This one is getting up there. Well, somebody won that yesterday. Now, a very tiny minority of people win. Now, that's the jackpot, and there are other lower value prizes of $1 million. Multiple numbers of people win those, but not very many still. Look at the statistics of this for a moment. The Mega Millions jackpot that was just won yesterday, the odds of winning that jackpot are 302,575,000 to 1. It's almost one person out of the whole population of the United States. There's 330 million in the U.S. So one person, if he wanted a 1% chance of winning, would have to buy 3,025,754 tickets to get a 1% chance of winning. On Quora, they answer questions on the internet. Quora, it says 90 million people in the U.S. play the lottery every year. 90 million people play that lottery. Somebody said this: buying lottery tickets is a tax on people who cannot do the math. Buying lottery tickets is a tax on people who cannot do the math. Now, is there something wrong with that? No. If it's disposable income, some people like to do it for fun, but it's tragic when poor people do it. Probably the majority of people who buy lottery tickets, millionaires don't buy lottery tickets. Billionaires don't buy them either. But many times poor people do when they don't have the discretionary income to play with that way. I won't turn. Proverbs 12, verse 11. He who tills his land will be satisfied with bread, but he who follows frivolity is void of understanding. So a more sure way to financial security is, of course, through diligent hard work. Here's another modern proverb. The harder I work, the luckier I get. It's tongue-in-cheek. You know, lucky, it's not luck, really. But it goes, the harder I work, the luckier I get. And of course, Thomas Edison made this quote famous: success is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Again, Thomas Edison. So the key to advancement in the Bible, to develop our skills, do the best with what we've been given in this life, is a principle to success. Back to Proverbs 22, verse 29. Proverbs 22, verse 29. Do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings and not stand before unknown men or obscure men. That is a life model of Joseph in action. A man who excelled in his work, he would stand before King Pharaoh and not before unknown or obscure men. You see, Joseph was in his most shining element when he brought prosperity to Egypt during those 7 years of plenty, in preparation for 7 years of famine, when many, many people came throughout the whole region into Egypt to buy food when it was there was terrible drought and famine for who knows how far, but people lived and their lives were spared because of the work that God directed Joseph to do in Egypt. The Proverbs 31 woman, I won't turn there, but it's a beautiful framework of a diligent woman in her home. She prepared ahead to feed her family for the scarcity of winter that was heading every year. And she fed her and clothed her servants as well. That speaks to being prepared. And there's much more to be said on that I won't include in today's message, but preparedness. Principle number 4 then is on being diligent in our work ethic. Finally, principle number 5. Manage money wisely. Manage money wisely. Once again, money can be a very important tool to teach us integrity, to teach us good stewardship, to teach us good judgment, and how to manage it is something that we learn from. Otherwise, if we don't manage it well, as soon as we earn it, it's gone, and we have very little to show for it at times. Proverbs 27, verse 23 is a very short passage that has a physical element to it, or principle, and a spiritual one. Proverbs 27, verse 23, it says, "Be diligent to know the state of your flocks and attend to your herds, for riches are not forever." So the physical aspect of that is very clear and obvious. Manage what we own. Take good care of things we own. At times, if you have a car that's 22 years old, you do what you can to keep it running, even though the price of parts and replacement and repairs goes up and up. And I use that as not many of you here in this room probably have a 22-year-old car. I do, but it's not our primary car. It's a secondary car, thankfully, because I don't know how much longer it's going to keep running, but happy to own it. Anyway, it's just a matter of trying to maintain things that we do own. The spiritual element that the ministry focuses on is, of course, to watch after God's flock that have been put in our care as a ministry of God's flock. So there is that spiritual element as well. But we see that There are always people in this world that just can't hang on to money, can't manage it, can't spend it correctly. Proverbs 22, verse 7. Let's get back there again. Proverbs 22, verse 7. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. The borrower is servant to the lender. This is another one of life's absolutes besides death and taxes, that the borrower is servant to the lender. Debt puts tremendous stress on families. Money problems are considered the second cause of divorce after infidelity in the United States. Infidelity, number one. Number two, financial concerns. The second highest issue or cause of divorce. So we all know the basics, that in addition to paying back principal on something, we're paying a huge amount on the borrowing part, which is interest. If we have mortgages, and we have a house mortgage, we haven't even put a dent in the principal yet. It's going to be, as they say, by the time you pay off a 30-year mortgage, you've doubled the price of the house that you bought. For X number of dollars, it's twice as much by the end of 30 years because of the interest you're paying for the first X number of years before you really start paying down on the principal. But that's just one of those things in life. It's hard to get away and around that. This is just one of those difficult areas in this day and age. But credit card debt, that's something that is a wise area to try to pay down and keep down low. Mr. Britt Taylor, our Church of God treasurer and chief financial officer, he drives that point home very strongly when he talks to the ministry about financial stewardship, ministerial continuing education. He talks about areas that we can manage our money, and getting out of credit card debt is a major one. Having a family budget helps us to show what's happening with our money, what we earn and where it goes. One simple way to hang on to more of our earnings is to be cautious about what we buy on credit, unless we can pay it back quickly, which is always a nice way to use credit cards to our advantage, when we can pay them off quickly. Proverbs 27, verse 20. Proverbs 27, verse 20 talks about managing our wants and desires versus our needs. This in the NIV Bible. Death and destruction are never satisfied, and neither are the eyes of man. In other words, human eyes are never satisfied. We'll always desire something, and that is so true. Once one want is fulfilled, our eyes turn to another want, and another and another. Skip back to chapter 21, verse 25. Chapter 21, verse 25. The desire of a lazy man, now this is one that won't work and doesn't have that work ethic, kills him, it says. The desire of the lazy man kills him, for his hands refuse to labor. He covets greedily all day long. So there's two elements here. There's one who doesn't have a work ethic, and one whose eyes are never satisfied. We realize, once again, that based on the rise of evil in the world, and how Jesus Christ said in the last days there would be an increase of lawlessness. And part of that is that the love of many will grow cold. But there will be an increase of lawlessness. We're seeing it. We're seeing it all the time in the current news. This is in Matthew 24, verse 12. Globally, we know that the time of Jacob's trouble will eventually come, again, to Israel first, and then the world will follow in crisis after crisis until just a percentage of humanity is left alive when Christ returns. It's very sad. Proverbs 11, verse 4. Please turn there. Proverbs 11, verse 4. It says, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. So people that accumulate great amounts of wealth thinking they're going to be safe and secure in a day of wrath, God says that's going to be swallowed up. It's going to be gone. There's not going to be the help that they had depended on. Verse 28, Proverbs 11, verse 28. He who trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish. Once again, keeping God focused and paying our vows to God. It says in Psalm 50, verse 15, I won't turn, Psalm 50, verse 15, call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. That's right after he says, offer thanksgiving to God and pay our vows to him. Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you. We all know that there are other unforeseen things that could happen to wipe out materials, wealth, and goods at any time. An accident, a natural disaster, a stock market crash, an extended illness, a criminal act. These are all things we face, let alone much deeper, troubling times ahead. The only lasting security is a right relationship with God. God is actually the head of every national economy on earth. God steers, he raises kings and lowers kings and nations. God is in charge or oversees every economy on earth. Deuteronomy 8, verse 18, I won't turn. Deuteronomy 8, verse 18. And you shall remember the Lord your God, Moses said through God to the Israelites, for it is he who gives you the power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. God gives us the ability and the means to get wealth. When a person recognizes and believes this, his approach toward money and wealth is quite different from those who don't have that awareness, don't have the knowledge that you and I have in front of us here in our Bibles. So principle number 5 was the instruction to manage our money wisely. My conclusion, Joseph's exemplary life and ability to plan, his resourcefulness, his stewardship, his integrity, they all played into how he handled managing affairs of state in Israel, in Egypt, but also how he managed the finances of building wealth for Egypt for 7 years of prosperity, and managing that food distribution during 7 years of famine. We can ask for that kind of wisdom that Joseph exercised. No, we're not going to probably get the same kind of visionary understanding that God gave to Joseph, because God put Joseph in that place for such a time as he did to save vast numbers of people from starvation. When he talks to his brothers late in the story, and they embrace and they cry on each other's shoulders, he says, yes, my brothers, you did this, but God placed me here for a reason, so that many people would be saved from starvation. My words. He demonstrated the what can I do right now where I am principle, and that helped him to rise to success. Money is a powerful tool to help us build character and wisdom and integrity. And if we put God first and we practice good stewardship, we can become a master of our money and not the slave to it. God tells us in prophecy we should expect adversities in the coming years. If we become more proactive, though, in our approach, what can I do now to help me financially in the years to come, especially through hard times? God will bless us with wisdom and understanding as we follow him. And he assures us that through difficulties and disappointments, in Romans 8, verse 28, let's always keep this thought in mind as I close. Romans 8, verse 28, all things work together for good for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose.